Hi, I'm Meryl Nicol and welcome to another episode of RVTS for GPs. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And welcome to this episode of RVTS for GPs, and today is a really special day where we will be discussing the recent publication in the Medical Journal of Australia in the October 2024 supplement, Volume 221, Issue 7 to be precise, of 5 research papers in total, all about the remote vocational training scheme. The published research outlined the successes and strengths of RVTS in training and retaining GPs in rural, remote and Aboriginal medical service settings throughout Australia over the past nearly 25 years now. Joining me today to talk about the research and the subsequent publication are Associate Professor Belinda O'Sullivan, a rural health system senior researcher with the University of Queensland, and Dr. Pat Giddings, the founder and CEO of RVTS. Welcome to you both, and thanks so much for joining me today. This recently published research addresses some very topical issues, such as general practice training of overseas trained doctors, providing quality supervised and supported GP workforce in rural and remote areas, as well as how it might be possible to continue to do this cost effectively. So this topic today is tremendously important, and it's a very timely publication. So Pat, if I can start with you, can you tell me how the whole process which led to this publication came about?
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. Well, we saw it as an opportunity after almost 25 years of operation of RVTS. RVTS has had external evaluations undertaken on a number of occasions over the years, but we had an opportunity at this point, probably following COVID. We had some funds left over from COVID. We managed to save some funds from COVID because we couldn't do all the activities that we normally do. And that gave us the opportunity to tender for an external evaluation. And part of the plan with the external evaluation was to publish the findings. There isn't a lot in the literature about RVTS. RVTS has been going for a long time now, and I think has had a pretty unique place in general practice and rural generalist training for rural and remote practice and Aboriginal medical services. It's had a unique place, and there's been very little in the way of publications, very little in the literature regarding the unique role and the unique outcomes that RVTS has delivered.
Okay, so for people maybe on the podcast who are new to RVTS, have joined us usually for different sort of educational content, what makes the RVTS training program different from other GP training programs in Australia?
Yeah, well, RVTS is quite unique because fundamentally it's a workforce program. It's a workforce retention program that's dressed up as a training program. And I say that a little flippantly. It really is a training program, but the training program is a means to retain doctors in their situation in which they're working at the time that they join the program. So it means that RVTS, being a retention program, requires doctors who enter the program to be already working in an eligible location, which for 2/3 of our doctors is in M, 4 to 7, so fairly remote locations, or in Aboriginal medical services outside the capital cities. So, so that makes RVTS quite different, and it means that doctors have to be working in location before they're eligible to join the program, which means they somehow have to get a provider number to be able to do that, to be able to access Medicare. And they're able to do that usually through a workforce program, another workforce program, which allows them to work in location for a short period of time, usually through the government-run rural workforce agencies, state-based rural workforce agencies. So RVTS comes along, and our role is to keep people that are already working in eligible locations, rural, remote and First Nations communities, and deliver training and support to them to ensure that they stay working in those communities, at least for the duration of their training. And I think with our evaluation, we've been able to demonstrate that we've done that pretty well.
So I understand with the RVTS in the nearly 25 years, it's like 24 and a half years, isn't it? They've been going. The GP training's been delivered to more than 500 doctors across 350 communities. So RVTS has already got this amazing extensive experience and runs on the board, if you like, in this space. I'm really interested to hear from Belinda as an independent evaluator, looking at the stakeholders and the communities, what came out from the research about what made RVTS special in that area?
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. So with it being quite a different model to regular rural GP training, but its focus on communities, we did want to hear the voice of stakeholders as to what they perceived the benefits were of the RVTS model. And some of the interesting findings were that the benefits were multi-level. They were firstly strongly felt by the health services, who really valued having continuity of staff. So not only that, but staff who could access training in the places where they desperately needed more doctors. And in doing so, they experienced, the doctors themselves experienced that continuity of longitudinal care. So being able to learn general practice in that context of staying in the same community. We also heard the doctors develop relationships, the trust that was built. The findings were that helped people to disclose more, and the doctors could also, in relationship with their patients, see health gains, which is really motivating when you're a learning doctor. And the other major benefits, of course, were the doctors retained their entitlements, and they preserved energy, not having to move communities frequently. And that's also really important when you're developing as a doctor and building your general practice skills. So overall, the other major finding there, Meryl, was that there's major gains to policymakers. And this was a finding that the program, the model that the RVTS uses to train doctors and support them to remain in the location where they're already based, really was important for First Nations communities, for major policy areas like closing the gap, but equally for the goals of the National Medical Workforce Strategy to build a sustainable primary healthcare workforce that's well distributed to the community where people most need doctors. And other major areas were the support the program gives to international medical graduates, with a significant national review called the Cruck Review in November 2023, identifying we do need this workforce desperately in Australia. We rely on them to fill gaps in our current workforce and our services, but they really need a good support model to work in many of the rural and remote communities where they're based, and they need access to good quality training and professional support. And it was lovely to see people identify that as a benefit of the RVTS program in the research that we did.
Yeah, with the health system increasingly reliant on overseas trained doctors or international medical graduates, did you identify anything particularly RVTS was doing well that enabled these overseas trained doctors to thrive and to get their fellowships with either ACRIM or RACGP? Because let's face it, if you're an overseas trained doctor, and I was one coming into Australia, I needed to get that ticket. I needed to have good educational support in the community where I was working. I know how I was supported as a registrar and found it very helpful, but what came out in the research? What made it? What was the secret sauce, if we're allowed to tell?
Yeah, one of the wonderful things about the independent research is we could hear from so many people through interviews and look at the available data to see, yeah, this program is operating and is achieving well above what we would expect from the published literature for the context where the RVTS works. So that is for doctors who are in more remote contexts and relative to their normal turnover rates, we could see the RVTS is achieving strong fellowship rates at 78% and was achieving great retention, which we can talk about further. This is really unusual for an international medical graduate cohort. So as you say, Meryl, one of the big questions we wanted to ask was why? What's it doing? And how can we understand this model so that we can think about how we can apply that to the wider practice across the rural system? So through interviews and other data collection methods and working with expert stakeholders, we looked at what was going on, and we identified the RVTS, which is a remotely delivered program for remote distance education and remote supervision, whilst people remain working in these challenging contexts and progressing in their GP training, does something special. And those things we identified were the program really helps to firstly build comfort. So people feel they're able to reach out and disclose things that are impeding on their sense of happiness, satisfaction, well-being, or their professional issues, that all things can be discussed. And there's plenty of places you can find help. Now, that's really important for remote doctors and doctors in First Nations settings where it's otherwise very difficult to get that advice and get it from people who are qualified and experienced and understand what you're talking about. So there's not this need to re-explain yourself every time you contact someone. So the first one was comfort. The second thing was confidence, and that was the ability to reach out whenever you need to. And that could be for any undifferentiated issue that you might face as a doctor. It could be a training issue, it could be a personal issue, but you're able to get real-time support and proactive responses. So issues are followed up, and they're followed up with sensitivity and confidence so that you know when you're facing all sorts of things, you may even just have something you need a bit of validation about a decision in that context. You can get that feedback system. The next one was competence. The RVTS was really excellent at this. We found from its multi-layered, scalable resources that were delivered routinely, so people didn't have to concern themselves and get, that level of psychological worry about, am I going to progress in training? Am I going to be okay? They could just park that concern and know that they were in a structured model that had their back, that would help them follow through a structured resources and the type of, the level of supervision and mentorship they needed to progress without, because in these more remote settings, obviously it's a worry about whether you're actually getting all the things that other people are getting when there's less doctors around you and you don't have so much peer-to-peer contact. And in line with that, the peer networks that the RVTS supported were a factor there. Being able to make friends was a key element of the program, because another lever we found was the program really builds a sense of belonging, and that is to doctors who turn up at the twice annual workshops, multi-day workshops for skill building, and whose families came along with them, really met other doctors like them. And this was is not rocket science, I get that, but when you're a doctor in a remote setting and you may not have many other contacts and career networks in Australia, if you come to these workshops, they are life-changing, and that ability to share with other doctors all the other skills you've sometimes brought into Australia from another country, but also for your families to connect. And the final lever there was bonding, and that sense of bonding with people through a mix of both face-to-face and online experiences, so that people felt they could reach out whenever they needed to, for sustaining that feeling of feeling socially recharged, connected to others and part of the social fabric of Australia, as much as being part of the Australian medical profession in a very legitimate sense. So these 5 levers, just to summarise, were comfort, confidence, competence, belonging and bonding. And we found this RVTS program was the first place where we could discover this, and it's going to be useful, I think, for wider application across rural and remote training and workforce programs, including because the RVTS model is unique. We could look at it, but secondly, because it's the first time we've really described professional support as being so tightly related to training. So the idea of educating people is often thought as a separate thing from building people's careers and supporting them as a practitioner overall and as a person. But what the RVTS model showed us is those things are very deeply interlinked and they shouldn't be separated if we really want to have person, place and profession-centred workforce training and development models.
Thank you so much. It's really good to hear those things: comfort, confidence, competence, belonging and bonding. And I can certainly remember as a mid to late 40s female doctor with sort of all this weird international experience. I'd worked in Africa for 8 years. I kept moving countries. It was quite hard to find your group of people who understood how come you were in your mid to late 40s and you were just doing your fellowship now, you know, like, and when I arrived at RVTS, it was almost like I found my people. And there were all these other people with these really interesting stories of specialties they've done and left behind in other countries, and all coming and wanting to make a go of general practice in Australia. So yeah, I really, that resonates with me, those 5 things. I think they're true in research and they were true for my own experience as well. Pat, can I hand over to you with your 24.5 years of watching this happen in real time at workshops and with supervisors, if you've got anything to add to the sort of research findings, if you like, and some of those things we've touched on.
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. Look, I must say that we're absolutely delighted with the work that Belinda's done. We've known for years and years that there was something special that we called the X factor or the secret sauce. There was something special that came out of what we did at RVTS. Not saying that we actually do anything special. It's just that the system that we've put together, which is pretty straightforward. You know, it's about distance learning and bringing people together to twice yearly residential workshops. It's pretty straightforward, really, and hooking people up with a supervisor it seemed to generate positive regard from the participants greater than what we would have expected, far in excess of what we would have expected. And we didn't quite understand that. We knew we did a good job. We knew that the training that we deliver was good quality, and we knew that our workshops were fun and enjoyable, but we just couldn't quite account for the almost off the scale approval that we got from the participants in the program. And the work that Belinda's done is the first time that we've really been able to objectively analyse that response. And I think it's been an eye-opener for me. It's demonstrated that you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It's about bringing together a whole range of factors, all under the banner of support, I must say. It's, you know, if we want to summarize the whole thing, it's about providing lots of support to people that are working in really challenging environments and who are really quite isolated and come from very diverse backgrounds. So that's a pretty tough starting point for a lot of individuals in the RVTS program. So add in a very comprehensive support program, lots of layers of support, high quality training, support that extends to families as well. That's a very powerful mix. And I think what we've come to realise is that that's not a very common package for international medical graduates. It's not to the level that we deliver it, and I think that's what's given us our understanding, is that not that we do anything particularly special, but the package that we put together of holistic professional support, which extends to family, is very, very powerful. and gives us results far in excess of what we might otherwise have expected, and what, as we understand, is the experience of other programs. We know that international medical graduates, and it's about 80% of RVTS participants have been international medical graduates, are generally speaking pretty unsatisfied with their working arrangements and their lot. But that's from the published data, not our published data, but previous studies. And the findings that we've discovered, or Belinda and her team have discovered, is that what we do flies in the face of that. And really the only thing that's different is the level of support, the comprehensiveness of the support package.
Thanks for that. You talked about that combination of distance learning. So we have, for example, weekly webinars, 90 webinars given over a 3-year program. We've got the twice yearly residential workshops for registrars and their families, which is the unusual part of that probably, and the remote supervision. And we have so much feedback anecdotally about how good our supervisors are, and many, in fact, are ex-RVTS registrars who really kind of want to give back and who remember what it was like to be in that situation. Was there anything from the publications that talked more about the remote supervision model and how that was borne out in the research, Belinda?
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. One of the things that was notable about the supervision model is, firstly, most of the literature that we have available to us is about face-to-face apprentice, master to apprentice style supervision. So this was a whole new model that the RVTS uses. And a lot of times people see that RVTS is about remote supervision. But in fact, the major finding of the evaluation was it's more about what the RVTS does. And so like what is in the source rather than how it's dished up. There was a lot of learning about the supervision model itself as well. So I'll just go into that. There are some differences that RVTS is mostly a remotely delivered supervision model, but because of the maturity and sort of smaller size of the program and the connection between being past registrar to current supervisor, yes, there is a level of cultural DNA and corporate knowledge within the supervision group, a level of commitment. But that probably the number one finding I'd have to say was the level of empathy and the capability of the supervisors and the mentors to give really calm, honest feedback that was contextualized to the situation, to the person, and able to be followed up with appropriate resources, including other contacts, and at times those supervisors even visiting the practice because they knew the practice, or leveraging their known contacts to resolve issues and therefore help registrars to remain calm, to remain poised. There's lots of reasons to stress out when you're working as a doctor in some of these settings, and it's really hard to know what to stress about. And the supervisors were able to give that calm, honest feedback and make it clear what things to worry about and what things not to worry about. And if there was something to worry about, what the steps were. So that it was, you could say it's pastoral, but it's actually just very empathetic and person-centered by a group of supervisors who are deeply committed, not to the RVTS, but deeply committed to rural and remote medicine and First Nations medical care. So that was the common thread. And the only other major difference was the registrars had access to an independent supervisor from their practice, and that person stayed with them on the journey. And that was a key lever to help people to feel comfortable in reporting things to their supervisor, because it was a relationship-based model. That relationship with that one supervisor was independent of the employer, which is important when you're thinking about what you're comfortable telling your employer and what you're not. But also the supervisor very much reinforced that person. The whole model was focused on sustaining someone in their local practice. So it was a different psyche to just kind of a tick and flick supervision model. but it was a supervision plus support model at all levels, focused on how do I help this person not just to learn, but to feel comfortable and confident staying where they are in their current practice. And that's what made it a really interesting piece of work for us as independent evaluators. So I hope that explains some things about the model and the way it's different, and also how our mainstream and wider supervision models that are used in Australia and overseas can learn from this.
Thank you. I mean, all this sort of family style, bespoke, small kind of one-on-one training with twice yearly workshops. I've certainly heard it said on the grapevine, well, that's all very well if you've got, a lot of money and RVTS is very expensive. But was that actually borne out in the research and in the figures? And I don't know if you want to comment on that first, Pat.
Well, you're absolutely right. That has been a common perception of RVTS, but as it turns out, RVTS, in terms of cost per registrar and training, is roughly equivalent to other rural general practice training programs around the country, and may even be a little bit cheaper. I think the perception of it being expensive relates to the workshops that we have, because the workshops are so good. They're big affairs. We have up to almost 150 doctors, including registrars and supervisors and families. It's a big deal, and people are together for 4 or 5 days, and with a large multi-layered program. So they're a big deal, and they cost a lot of money to produce. But they're also a centerpiece for the program. And there's many other aspects of RVTS which are quite economical. So the whole package is roughly equivalent. And I think the independent evaluators came to the same conclusion.
Over to you, Belinda.
Thank you. Yeah, look, it's a really important question to ask about cost benefit, cost effectiveness. So firstly, the evaluation was able to draw out the actual design and inputs of the RVTS model, and to make sure that there's not this assumption that you're comparing like with other GP training programs. But of course, just being clear, because the RVTS is more than just a training model. It's focused on people who are already in the community, and then training is one of many things it does to support retention. So the other GP training models, though, were used as a comparator, and we tried to look at exactly what the different models put in. To be clear, the RVTS supports 3 years of practice-based training, and the rest of GP training is usually slightly less at 2 years. So just being clear, though, relative to the number of years of practice-based training, we did cost out per registrar, including all of the cost of the workshops and everything that's put in. And it came out, as Pat mentioned, on about par in terms of cost effectiveness for its years of practice-based training. Taking conservative estimates, that was good, because it meant that the model is not more expensive, and particularly not more expensive when we factored in the fact most of the RVTS years of practice-based training occur in MMM 4 to 7 locations, and they are for a cohort who we know are less satisfied and more likely to turn over in these settings. To overcome those general trends of a workforce turning over who's not satisfied, and think about the outcomes achieved relative to the cost being about the same as other rural GP training, it was telling us the story that this program is good value for money. What we did want to do more work on, and what the evaluation pointed to, is perhaps a new ideation that we need to think about as a community in rural health, is thinking about retention years of return for investments in training, rather than looking at an input costing model of cost per registrar, starting to look at how much we're getting in return of years of service of a registrar to a community relative to cost inputs. And so it's a different way of thinking about things, but it's actually really important if we want to take a community focus and think about wanting doctors who we know, who we can trust, who we can tell all of our personal stories to, is the community wants doctors to stay for longer. And if we want that to be the focus, then retention years of return is actually a relevant metric that we might want to think about within our rural training and workforce systems.
Thanks. And the program is usually 3 years, as you say, but our outcome registrars are 3 years plus advanced skill year, so that can be up to 4 years in a community. Pat, is there any data about how often people will remain on in their community even after their training is finished? Like, do they just finish their training and they're out of there?
Well, that was part of the evaluation, and we were very interested in that level of retention and beyond training. So we discovered from the data that the average time of an RVTS registrar spent in their community was 5.2 years. So there's average of 1.6 years in location prior to coming onto RVTS, and then an average of 3.6 years with RVTS. So that's 5.2 years in total in the one location. And we're suggesting that without RVTS that people would have moved on by then. Their average 1.6 years in their community. The likelihood is that they would have moved on in a relatively short period of time, but RVTS has been able to stretch it out for another more than 3.5 years. And for up to 50% of participants, they stay on in their community for another 2 years. So for up to 50%, there's 7.2 years, more than 7 years retention in the one location. Now, some people will say, oh, okay, well, that's because of the 10-year moratorium. As you know, in Australia, we have international medical graduates. We have a requirement that IMGs work in M 4 to 7 for a period of 10 years. But the evaluators looked at the comparison between Australian medical graduates in the program and international medical graduates and could find no correlation there, that the decision to stay on and that period of time was independent of the individual doctor's requirements for the 10-year moratorium. So to summarise, RVTS appears to have had a big impact on workforce retention. And as Belinda had pointed out before, that has flow-on effects in terms of savings to the community. You know, not just we, as Belinda put it, in terms of cost per registrar, that metric of retention years translates into savings, broader savings in costs of better continuity of care, reduced costs of transfers, reduced costs of locums, which, as you know, are very, very expensive. So huge cost savings right across the board. So the relatively small investment in an RVTS registrar and supporting an RVTS registrar on a yearly basis for 3 or 4 years is greatly eclipsed by the savings, the ongoing economic savings to the community and to the overall system by having a doctor in place who's supported, who's skilled, competent, comfortable.
Exactly.
With belonging and bonding, who's comfortable to stay in that location for an extended period of time with all those subsequent flow-on savings to the overall system and support to their community that they provide.
This may be an ignorant question, but all those hidden costs of all the locum hours saved, is that ever factored into the research, Belinda, or is there an estimate given, or is it not yet factored in?
Yeah, so there's not a lot of research about locums, to be honest with you, as a system, and yet we know that they need to be factored in. The health services themselves know how expensive they are, and they feel the brunt of it. The community feels the brunt of it too when they don't know what doctor they might get if they get one. And I'd have to say that there's a lot of things to factor in when you're costing the value of a retention program. But the estimates of the cost of turnover have been done in the Northern Territory for primary healthcare workforce turnover, and the cost savings of just stemming the tide of turnover are just, the cost savings are incredible and should be pursued in every state and territory. It's not just a Northern Territory problem. It may be worse in some places than others, but I think most states and territories would say that it is the cost of recruiting people. They expect doctors in MMM 4 to 7, so that more rural and remote communities to start turning over at around 2 years. So that's where the figures of the RVTS of achieving doctors staying 50% staying in that same community over 7 years are simply outstanding. And including, I must be very clear here, including our Aboriginal medical services where turnover is also so problematic. And the other thing that is notable about where the costs are borne, these are in communities the RVTS supports, which the data that we looked at shows the RVTS supports, you might think, oh, they'd just go to the nearest coastal locations, but no, it's 70% an inland program. So, you know, this is really locations that do feel the brunt of locum workforce overuse. And the other thing is, it's not just MMM 4 to 7 or rural First Nations communities, but to be honest, we found most of the RVTS points to MMM 5 to 7 locations. So we are actually talking about settings where the RVTS is a key solution. The question we have as a community in rural health and rural medical workforce is, how can we get more of the RVTS, I think? Are there places we could do more of it? And that is, the research and the evaluation data showed that the program, as you can imagine, is dependent upon people being in the community already and ready to sign up and be in an eligible community, ready to sign up for the RVTS. If you're one of those people, the RVTS is probably ready to take you on. But some of the issues we found for policy making is there's less and less, drive and mandation to encourage our domestic workforce and even our international medical graduates to go to the more remote communities, to the more rural and remote places, with the distribution levers being, less than they used to be. And it's a real issue because if we have wonderful models that can train and support people to be retained in these places, then we really do need pathways to get eligible candidates to the communities where they can be supported with models like this.
Thank you. You've touched on a couple of things I think we need to talk about in more depth. One is targeted recruitment, and one is our long-term support of registrars, particularly within Aboriginal medical services. So, as you've talked most about that need to support communities who don't have a doctor, tell us, Pat, please, about the targeted recruitment model and what's happened in that space.
Yeah, thanks, Meryl. Well, as we've mentioned, the original RVTS training model, the workforce retention model, was just that, about workforce retention. People had to be in location at the time of applying for their training to be eligible. Now, not that long ago, pre-2018, we would talk to a lot of stakeholders, would say, oh, that's fantastic, RVTS, what a great program. How can we get an RVTS doctor? Mm-hmm. And the short answer was, well, actually, it's quite difficult. First of all, you would have to recruit someone to your community. They would have to be on a workforce program, usually through the Rural Workforce Agency. They'd have to go through a few steps to become established there. They'd actually have to be there and working at the time of application to be eligible. And then, if they're successful, they might get into RVTS. So you can see it's not a very direct mechanism for recruiting. And so that's where we came up with a variant to the RVTS model. For a small number of positions, the Commonwealth agreed that we could utilise a small number of our positions, actually up to 5 per year, where we use the RVTS training and support model as part of the recruitment package to assist communities to recruit doctors. So we worked with the rural workforce agencies and some state government departments to identify communities of high workforce need. And obviously we've only got 5 for the whole country each year, so it's a very small number. And so this commenced in 2018, just before COVID. And since that time, we've recruited about almost 30 doctors through that mechanism. And it's been successful. And we've managed to recruit some outstanding doctors to some very, very challenging and remote settings, places that have struggled to recruit doctors for a long period of time. So in that sense, it's been very successful. We've also learned a lot as an organisation about how better to support people in these settings. And we see this as a real potential solution on a larger scale across rural and remote Australia and First Nations communities. And interestingly, in that group, while RVTS overall has about 80% international medical graduates, it's about 50-50 Australian and international medical graduates in the targeted recruitment group. So we seem to be, it's appealing more to a subgroup of domestic graduates that are interested in doing something different, working in an interesting environment, practicing interesting medicine, having relative autonomy. So that's been an interesting learning as well. But yeah, I hope that gives you an idea of what targeted recruitment is.
Thanks for that, Pat. And that was also one of the papers was focused on targeted recruitment, wasn't it, Belinda? Could you tell us from your perspective the major findings?
Yeah, sure. So the targeted recruitment strategy, to look at that, we did 2 focus groups and we used the administrative data about the people involved and compared that to the rest of the RVTS cohort. And just to be clear, once people are in the community on the targeted recruitment strategy, they join the regular RVTS remote or Aboriginal medical service stream. So what we wanted to understand was what are the early results and what are the areas for optimisation. Because the strategy was 5 years in at the time we evaluated it, we wanted to understand that and to allow us to hear from both the people who are the stakeholders involved. We had one focus group, and the other focus group was the participants largely. And we put the 2 data sets together to kind of triangulate the data and worked with a project reference group so that we were making sure we were analysing it with appropriate insights. And we could test any assumptions, but also clarify the actual results. We're not biased, but we're actually evidence-based. And the good news was the overarching theme was unanimously everyone thought it was a really useful idea to use this, that it's a very valuable strategy for communities to access a doctor and use the RVTS model so that doctor can be trained whilst they're working in the community. Probably some of the key findings, though, were that, as Pat mentioned, that it's around a 50-50 split of local Australian trained and international medical graduates. And on top of that, they're moving to a community often for the first time, and they're often moving there into general practice for the first time. And so the group does need nuanced support. So it's like they need a little bit more early coaching and orientation and perhaps more face-to-face visiting in those early settling in periods to accommodate the fact that it's complex and sometimes, well, particularly for the domestically trained cohort, it's even more confronting at times because many domestic graduates are very committed to become rural and remote doctors, but may have not the level of background as our international medical graduate group who've gone through a migration experience and settling families in a new country. So it's quite a confronting experience, and every community you go to has a different culture. And so it's just about understanding how to work with that group, ensure they're appropriately supported, that we're picking the most appropriate practices where they've got a focus on teaching and learning and not just service, acknowledging that the need for doctors is extreme. Another key finding was that there's going to be a need with the targeted recruitment strategy to think about where to target because there's so much need. The question is, well, how do you judge, communities that are most appropriate and that have a relevant amount of need, but they're safe and equipped for training doctors who are potentially, as I mentioned, newer to general practice and new to the community. Huge potential to use this as a lever to expand place-based targeted workforce training and recruitment strategies, particularly where the evaluation identified where it can be coupled with working with, for example, specific states or territories to build a really solid employment model and a package that could be marketed, and therefore, and even places where the support model can be supplemented, because here we're talking about the RVTS using their own bucket of funding, but there's ways that the RVTS could be supplemented, and this could be quite a robust and holistic way to address place-based workforce need and build up that cohort of people who are happy to relocate and get that support and structure of training that the RVTS can provide.
It sounds like a really exciting opportunity for the future. Does anyone have any further comments on targeted recruitment before we move to First Nations Health? Anything else, Pat, you want to say about targeted recruitment?
Just one other feature of the targeted recruitment model is that the locations tend to be more remote, and the locations tend to be in M 6 and 7, which is remote and very remote Australia. That's how it's classified. Whereas our retention model tends to be focused more around M 5. So it's generally the locations are far more remote and very remote locations. And that's been a great win for so many of those locations. But as Belinda points out, the challenge is there is so much need out there. The challenge is working out which location to target. That's the real challenge.
So we're not quite at the point where I'm in a M 6 and I can't find a doctor for my clinic, I can just ring up RVTS and get one. That's very sad.
Not at this point in time, I'm afraid, Meryl.
So just talking about First Nations Health, because RVTS has always been deeply committed to supporting First Nations Health, and I may have got the date wrong. Was it 2016 there was a specific Aboriginal medical stream started, or 2015?
Actually 2014.
Completely wrong. So since 2014, and RVTS has got a reconciliation action plan, and also we have cultural mentors one-on-one for every registrar who's in an Aboriginal medical service, and we have Professor Marlene Drysdale who runs our whole cultural education program. That's a 6-webinar based program, and also the workshop cultural program, and that's rolled out to every single registrar. What was born out of the research as far as Aboriginal medical services, Belinda? Was there anything particular that came out of the research?
Yeah, so the research showed that of the over 500 candidates who've gone through the RVTS, 71 have been based in Aboriginal medical services, which I don't know if other programs might have data, but that's remarkable. And I think there's been a lot of history about training effectively in Aboriginal medical services that we could see come through in the data. The targeted recruitment strategy is very important for Aboriginal medical service positions, particularly because people are interested in working in First Nations health with a strong equity focus, and with appropriate cultural training can do such a good job in that setting. But I think the targeted recruitment strategy has been stronger in it's got an equivalent uptake in Aboriginal medical services as it has in other remote general practices. So that's got to be considered about, well, should the targeted recruitment strategy be used to specifically target and improve our capacity for medical services in First Nations communities? So that was really interesting. The community level showed the RVTS provides good value to First Nations communities because their number one issue often with medical care is high turnover and doctors who may not have access to supervision. So inadequate capacity to build training pathways in those settings, and a real need for support to manage different pressures that you might face if you're working in an Aboriginal medical service. And so there's a real corporate knowledge in the RVTS around how to do that well, is what we saw, and that the retention focus of the RVTS model seemed to align very strongly with our desire for sustainable quality services that meet the needs of First Nations people in Australia.
Thanks very much. Pat, would you like to comment about the RAP or the commitment to First Nations health within RVTS over the years?
Well, 71 registrars to the end of 2023 have done the entirety of their training in Aboriginal community-controlled health services. That's pretty remarkable, I think, and there's probably no other program that's ever been able to deliver that. So we're very proud of that, and it's an important part of RVTS training. The doctors that we draw on from Aboriginal Medical Services, the number working in Aboriginal community-controlled health services that don't have their fellowship is relatively small, and so it's a small number that we draw on. But I think we've made a significant impact over the years. As you point out, the organisation's has a reconciliation action plan, and we're now onto our second iteration of that plan. And I must say that that's been transformative for us as an organisation. I was a little bit sceptical at the outset that, it's just another plan, perhaps another box ticking exercise. But in actual fact, the reality was that it required us as an organisation to make a commitment in an organised way with resources attached to that. And I've seen, since our first Reconciliation Action Plan, a transformation in the culture of our organisation. So cultural sensitivity of our staff, of our team, the cultural knowledge of our team, and the enthusiasm of our team around cultural and First Nations issues in particular. So any organisation out there that's vacillating whether or not they should put in place a reconciliation action plan, I would say vacillate no more. Just go for it. It's been a remarkable and very, very positive experience for us as an organisation.
And I just wanted to add one more thing to that, is like the sort of stories we heard in the evaluation where registrars being in communities where there's, strong cultural dimensions of care, but they're new to the community, new to general practice. And they said it was invaluable for them to have a cultural mentor who they could reach out and get help from, who could connect them with the community so they could understand the dynamics. And, how rich is it that doctors can learn in their training by staying with that same community over time, with cultural mentor support and specific training. So it's sort of that challenge of also of it being quite different depending on which community you're in. You can't assume any knowledge. And I think the RVTS registrars were just so grateful that they could reach out once again to get help with all number of issues that they might be trying to navigate as a learner and as a doctor in that community over a long period of time.
Thanks so much. Well, we've talked quite a lot about the holistic nature of RVTS training with really important, empathetic, compassionate, skilled supervisors. We've got a high quality training program. We've got this tremendous administrative RTC base who are the touch point for each registrar. We've got medical educators assigned to each registrar. And then, of course, we've got the cultural education team that sort of is overarching for everyone. I was just interested, Belinda, as you did the research, if you look at it as a whole, which is a really unfair question, was there anything you really were surprised by that you did not expect to find that was just like I really didn't expect to find that? Yeah, I'm just interested. Did anything surprise you?
Yeah, Meryl. Probably the number one thing for me is I had done some previous research and evaluation on supervision, rural supervision, and remote supervision. And when I came into the evaluation space with Matthew McGrail and the rest of the team at the University of Queensland, we were originally conceptualising this as a remote supervision training. How good to understand that. What really struck me was how little I understood about how much the education and training system, for good supervision to be good, it also needs to be married very strongly with person and place-centred support. And so by doing the work, I know I shifted my mindset from supervision as being something that is good, to understanding supervision in this context for these doctors, supervision and professional support and career guidance, mentorship and openness to answer any question with appropriate tailored resources. So that agility of the program to do that, yeah, that was my light bulb moment, that you need to have that multi-layered approach. And you need the agility as a program to be able to be responsive, and that means less rigidity and more capacity for tailoring. And for me, I hope to take this learning forward and to think about learning from what people say is a small program and keeping on thinking, is it really that small when it's been going for 24 and a half years already, and it's delivered for 50% of every registrar, 7.2 years of continuity with over 90% satisfaction and 78% fellowship. I don't think that's small. I think it's cumulatively, it's a massive impact. And I think a well-designed, well-implemented program like this can teach us a lot. I've really thoroughly enjoyed learning from the RVTS, and I'm grateful to everyone who spoke to us as part of the evaluation and our stakeholder advisory group. And I'm also grateful to work with Pat Giddings, a CEO who's been consistently dedicated to the effort. To run a program like this is not easy, but I've met Pat Giddings and become familiar with so many wonderful staff who make it a reality. And my hope would be that the MJA supplement is a step forward in what we might see is wider thinking and wider application of the things that we know and have learned from the RVTS.
Thank you so much. So you're talking about this wider impact. I love the sort of longitudinal size that you're referring to, that this isn't taken in a slice. It might be small, but taken overall, it's actually a massive impact. But do you think it's scalable on a broader reach? And I would invite Pat or Belinda to speak to that.
Meryl, I think it is. Certainly, it can be applied in different areas and different contexts. And we've done that with some work with other programs that aren't the remote vocational training scheme, to a small degree, and we've been able to demonstrate that the same principles apply. And why wouldn't they? People are people. It's the same. We just happen to have a group that we're fortunate enough, and I hope they're fortunate enough to have been matched up with RVTS. But there are so many potential RVTS doctors out there, or doctors working away in rural and remote Australia, that have the same need. It's a huge number. And so, yes, the RVTS model, I think we've shown that we've got a model, we've developed a model, we've implemented a model that's been very successful in terms of supporting people in resource-poor environments, and particularly international medical graduates. I'd like to think that we've got a best practice model for support of international medical graduates, which I think is very relevant. It's very timely that the Cruck review came out about the same time as this evaluation, because I think the learnings from this evaluation and from the experience of RVTS mean that we've got a tool, we've got a system, we've got tools that we can apply to other groups across the board, not just doctors either, and not just general practice, other disciplines, other specialties, but also other disciplines as well, working in health. So, I'm very proud of what our team have been able to achieve in the last 24 and a half years. It's been remarkable, and it's kept me going all that time and kept me enthused, and I'm still enthused. I'm still a big fan of RVTS after all this time. And I know that our team, what motivates our team of our admin team and our educators is just that we can see that what we do actually makes a difference. It makes a difference to individual doctors, but we know it makes a difference to those communities as well. And when you can see that you're actually making a difference with what you do with your day-to-day work, that's pretty inspiring and motivating. And I think that's what keeps us all going in this game, yourself included, Meryl. And
Absolutely.
It's been wonderful to be able to have the privilege to be able to do that, but it's also been wonderful to work with the team from the University of Queensland, led by Belinda and Matthew McGrail. They approach their work with great professionalism and diligence, and were able to to define some of those outcomes, that some of those, the X factor that I talked about, the secret sauce in particular, that we knew was there, but we've never been able to define it before, and they've been able to do that. And I think that's really useful. It's probably the most significant outcome of this evaluation is being able to put some theory around what we've always done, so that it is more transferable, so we can learn from it, so that other programs can learn from it, so that it can be applied more widely. So I'm so grateful to Belinda and Matthew and the team, so that we've got that published now and it's in the literature, and hopefully that's going to be taken up by others, not only in Australia but around the world, because it's great work and it's something that we should all be very proud of.
Thank you so much. Any final comments from you, Belinda? I think we've nearly said it all.
Yeah. Just final from me would be, yes, I think the RVTS has a number of, from what we can see, a number of good components that can be used in a number of different ways, and pending the decisions of government and where we are with policy development. But recognising, if we want to be centred on what the community needs, there's what we found as evaluators is there's a number of magic wands in this program, some things that you can apply and put together, almost modularise some of the things, like a targeted recruitment strategy and the needs in the Northern Territory, or you can think about the focus of the training knowledge about how you train in AMSs without needing local supervisors. You can also put this program together with different distribution levers, or with the need that we have to better support pathways to produce safe international medical graduates who feel productive, who feel like they belong and are very legitimised as part of our workforce, and not just people that fill gaps, but people who have genuinely brought good skills and experience to our country, and how we can use them and work with people with such beautiful diversity. So thank you for the opportunity to evaluate the program. As I said, I will be taking the knowledge forward, including the theory, but also in consideration of where we're heading as the Australian medical workforce system goes through a number of transitions. But I surely hope that politics wouldn't get in the way of a good outcome, and that we can continue to be evidence-based in our approach and be mindful of the resources that we need. The RVTS may be something that continues in its current size and form, if resources are going to remain the same, or it could scale up, in certain ways. Thanks, Meryl.
Thank you so much. Well, once again, I'd just like to thank Dr. Pat Giddings, CEO of RVTS, and Associate Professor Belinda O'Sullivan from the University of Queensland for joining me today. And I'd highly recommend anyone interested in general practice training, rural workforce retention, and overseas doctors training, or international medical graduate training, to take time to read the supplement in October 2024 MJA supplement. So thank you so much for joining me, and yes, have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening to RVTS for GPs. Download previous episodes on the podcast app of your choice, and please like and subscribe to help others find us. Have a great day.